on this screen, bring up this screen. Okay, people on Zoom, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, Professor.
Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, great. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to just interject. I'm happy to stop, slow down, whatever it is that people need. So last week we were talking about the way in which various different European countries had different motivations as they came out of Europe and explored what they call the New World. It was also the same with the English. And the reason that we follow their story is it's kind of the traditional way that the textbooks do it. Even though, of course, the area of the Southwest that we live in was colonized by the Spanish, and then it became part of Mexico, the textbooks still kind of follow the trajectory of starting with the East Coast and moving westward, so that is what we will also be doing. The point that I want to make today, one of my main points, is that it was never a guaranteed deal that European powers would have a foothold in the Americas. And that the English in particular were only able to succeed in terms of planting themselves in the Americas due to the assistance of Native Americans and the assistance of the microbes and stuff that we talked about in relation with the Columbian Exchange last week. I had various people mention in the discussion Squanto and why he's always sort of left out of the narrative in terms of being an example of Native Americans and colonial powers working together. It's funny that people should say that because that used to be sort of like the paradigm example of how things were in the Americas. You read in elementary school textbooks about how Squanto helped the settlers know what to plant and stuff like that. We're going to be talking about Tisquantum today. That was his full adopted name rather than Squanto, which is kind of a bastardization of his name. And what his actual backstory is, it's a little bit less cheerful and positive than people might assume. Okay. So last week we talked about some of the factors that propelled European powers out of Europe, that they started from a basis of feudalism, and that then things started to change. The mindset started to change, religious beliefs, the emphasis on the individual. There was a whole series of things. And in the very early part of English colonization, this was also true because the first successful English expedition to the New World happened right around the same time as the first successful Spanish Inquisition, or Spanish, there's an interesting Freudian slip, Spanish colonization of the New World. In 1497, Henry VII, who was Henry VIII's father, sent a Genoese merchant adventurer on a trip to the New World. This was John Cabot, or Giovanni Caboto, as was his actual name. And he sailed from England and discovered what is today Newfoundland, the English or the Canadian Maritimes. Claimed Newfoundland for England. Got funded for another try after coming back to England, but then perished on the second voyage. There were a couple more expeditions during the reign of Henry VIII, including a mapping expedition that mapped the whole eastern seaboard of North America. But after that interest lapsed, Henry VIII was much more interested in the issue of making sure that he had an heir, and so he got married 6 times and beheaded 2 of his wives and divorced 2 of his wives, and 1 died in childbirth. So he was kind of too busy to worry about exploration. But the church that he founded, the Church of England, founded because the Pope would not give him a divorce from his first wife, kind of put England in a different position religiously than most of the rest of the European continent. You see, with Henry VIII being the head of the church in England, England was no longer Catholic, and there was competition for evangelism between the main Catholic country, which was Spain, and England. The way that this panned out the most was in 1588. The Spanish Armada attempted to, Armada is like a naval flotilla, came up from Spain and attempted to invade England with troops.
To try to reinsert like Catholicism again? Or what was their purpose of the invading?
Yeah, their purpose was to reinstate Catholicism. It's like making a long story very short, but there had been a Catholic ruler in between Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Henry VIII's first daughter, her oldest daughter, Mary, had returned the country to Catholicism briefly. And then as soon as she was out of the way, as soon as she died, Elizabeth I, his second oldest daughter, reimposed the Church of England. So, Spain saw an opportunity there. Also, their prince had been briefly married to Queen Mary, Mary Tudor. So anyway, that is a whole nother class that I teach, Tudor Stuart England. But suffice it to say that, religious beliefs and religious evangelicalism was one of the reasons for England's desire to gain colonies. A second major reason was that England was kind of on the cutting edge of economic development at this time. Joint stock companies, that is, companies of private investors with the approval of the Crown, could form into companies of exploration to go to new areas of the world, begin exploiting resources, trading. In 1555, for example, the Muscovy Company was founded to explore trade with Russia. The Levant Company was formed in 1581 to undertake trade with Turkey and Muslim world. And as we're going to see, the Virginia Company gets set up to create an English presence in the New World, in North America. And then finally, Ireland provided an opportunity for the British to experiment with the same kind of plantation-based colonization that they would end up pursuing in North America. There had been an English presence in Ireland since the 13th century, but English law was limited to a small area around Dublin called the Pale. The Pale of Settlement. There, English law was imposed, English was spoken, English currency was used. Beyond that, so if you've ever heard the phrase beyond the pale, meaning something truly outlandish or frankly nutty, beyond the pale, Irish chieftains, hereditary chieftains were in charge. Irish Gaelic was spoken, Irish laws were followed, the Catholic Church was followed. So Ireland was this place where it was already sort of a colony of England. Beginning in the 1570s, the English government decided to try to subdue the Irish. The Irish were seen by the English as kind of a lesser people. Their church was suspect by English standards. They were considered to be somewhat barbarous people. And so the idea was, let's plant some Protestant settlers in Ireland, and we'll set up plantations. So there were like three different times, three different experiments, where the English shipped large numbers of Protestant farmers to Ireland, gave them land, gave them control of the people, and had them work to cultivate the land. Does that remind you of any practice by any of the other European powers that we have talked about in here so far? People on Zoom, any thoughts?
Kind of like what Spain did with in North America with indigenous people.
Exactly. So it was kind of like Spain's encomienda system, where people were given plots of land and the labor of the workers there in order to kind of hopefully implant Spanish values and practices in the Americas. English noblemen put down rebellions in Ireland with a lot of violence and brutality. Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who would go on to plan one of the next English expeditions to North America, was so violent that he had the heads cut off of all of his enemies and paved the walkway to his house in Ireland with his enemies' skulls. So, just like the movie Apocalypse Now. Okay, all right. Sir Humphrey Gilbert would be responsible in exploration of Newfoundland for England in the 1580s, but died on the return voyage. Okay, any questions so far? I'm gonna stop share for a second, look in the chat. No? Okay. Okay. All right, so in 1584, the English government decided to allow one of the merchant adventuring companies to set out for the New World. This expedition was masterminded by the Queen's favorite, Sir Walter Raleigh. The Queen never married, but she had a number of men in her orbit who were kind of her good friends. This expedition landed on an island off the shore of what is today North Carolina. There was some attempted communication between the indigenous people of the place and the English. The English were given the impression that the name of the place that they had landed was called Wingandacoa. But this was just the very beginning of a long history of translation problems between Native Americans and the English, because actually what they said apparently was nice clothes. So the two of them thought they were talking to each other. The Native Americans did not reject the overtures of the English right away. There was some trade that took place. The chief's wife even showed the English soldiers hospitality by washing their clothes and bathing their feet. And the English came away with the idea that the Native Americans were a peaceful, childlike people living in a golden age, kind of in the infancy of their civilization, who, with the help of the English, could be brought up to a level that would make them suitable as sort of quasi-Europeans. So that was the first expedition. By the second expedition, however, the local native people had learned how to deploy the Europeans against their own enemies, using them as leverage. They would say, oh, well, you know, there's some treasure off in that direction, sending the English in the direction of their rival tribes, who would then fight with them, fight with the English. So they were much more canny than the English supposed. Ultimately, relations soured between the Native Americans and the English. There was a shootout in 1586. The local leader, his name was Pamisapan, he was killed, his head was cut off. And at that point, the English made an interesting decision. They decided to go back to England to get supplies, but to leave 15 men behind to kind of hold down the fort. It's not a literal fort because they hadn't really built anything much, but to, you know, be in charge of the cannon that they had unloaded. In 1587, a second group of English, a second expedition, or a third expedition really, took off for the New World, carrying the artist John White. And that is an impression of what the artist John White would have looked like drawing from life. Let me show you some of the things that he painted. These are the first sort of visual images of the Native Americans of Virginia and environs that made it back to England. As you can see, very naturalistic in terms of the body adornment, the hair, the tattooing, the weapons, what the longhouses look like, the crops. You can see some people dancing in the foreground of the village of Secaton. The sort of naturalism of John White's painting contrasts a lot with the sort of idealized vision of what the indigenous people of the New World look like. And you can see a sort of idealized vision in the lower left of this particular slide. But it really should give you an appreciation for the extent to which John White was trying to represent what he actually saw. It should come as no surprise to you to learn that in 1587, when the John White expedition got to what they called Virginia, they couldn't find any sign of the 15 guys that they had left the year before. They had just magically disappeared. Okay, so on this particular voyage, John White's voyage, some men, women, and a few children were left to start a colony, while John White and the governor and a few others sailed back to England. That was in 1587. But what happened in 1588 that I already told you about?
Spanish Armada.
That's exactly right. So the Spanish Armada meant that nobody could get back to this area of Virginia for 3 more years. After the Spanish Armada, they tried, but they got blown off course. There were hurricanes, and people ended up in the Caribbean. Suffice it to say that finally in 1590, some English boats arrived at a place called Roanoke and found that there were no signs of English people. It was kind of touching. They thought that there was going to be a thriving civilization there, and they didn't want to like sneak up on the people and scare them. So they camped in the woods and they played music. They had some instruments. They were trying to not sneak up and scare the people, but when they got there, there were no people. All that there was on a tree, Croatoan. The word Croatoan was carved. All the houses and the possessions that existed had been either burned or buried. And so what happened to the Roanoke colonists was a mystery. What do you think might have happened to them?
You probably prefer the indigenous people culture. You probably assimilated with them and left without leaving trace. But if I remember right, I think they found some skeletons in there. So who knows? There might have been a battle
Might have
between the
been
indigenous
invaded.
people. Yeah, they probably just captured and I don't know.
Yeah, it's very possible that there was some fighting, that some of the people went with the indigenous people. There was a kind of practice in early America for indigenous Americans to especially take women and children into their tribes to replace members who had been lost. And there were oral history accounts of the natives of the area having some ancestors with blonde hair and blue eyes. So it's entirely possible that some of them got absorbed into the Indian village of Croatoan. But honestly, nobody really knows. It's a mystery. The point of this long anecdote about the mystery at Roanoke is this. The English were not destined to be able to successfully implant a colony in North America. Despite the fact that they had guns and they had advanced navigational instruments, they needed assistance to get a foothold, or it never would have happened. And that assistance came from the Native Americans. In 1606, so we're fast forwarding quite a bit through the reign of Elizabeth I and going on to the reign of James I of England. In 1606, James I established 2 companies to explore North America. And one of these companies was sent out in 1606 in 3 ships to find a route to the South Seas and to find the lost colony of Roanoke. 101 men and 4 boys finally landed on a semi-island in what is today the James River. Gee, I wonder how it got named the James River. In May 1607. Within a month, they completed the building of a large triangular fort. They didn't realize that they made their large triangular fort in a malarial swamp. I mean, they didn't even really have mosquitoes in England. So they didn't know, okay, if these annoying things bite you, they could be transmitting a disease that you can die from. There was also unfit water supplies, typhus, and the fact that the colonists who were sent to Jamestown in this very early set of expeditions were really not suited to the prospect of tilling the soil. What the Jamestown merchant adventurers thought was they were going to search for like gold and precious metals. They brought some jewelers with them as though that would be helpful. But they really did think they were going to be able to trade for food with the Native Americans. So they brought a bunch of like copper beads and things that they knew from slight experience previously that Native Americans liked as trade goods. However, it was a time of poor harvests in the Americas too. And so the Native Americans, if they didn't have anything to share or didn't have enough to trade with the English, then they just weren't going to do it. By 1609, the settlers had met one terrible disaster after another. Lots of people died from disease, some died in Native American attacks. There was a really harsh winter over 1609, 1610. It was so bad that it was called the starving time. The English traded arms and valuable work tools for a pittance in food. The fields lay fallow, largely because the English didn't know how to grow anything. The weak settlers were easy pickings for the Native Americans. They were trapped within the walls of their fort. And the Jamestown residents ate their way through their livestock, their pets, mice, rats, and then finally, as somebody pointed out this week in the discussion area, each other. Some turned to cannibalism, digging up the bodies of both English and indigenous dead people and attempting to eat them.
Didn't a man eat his wife who was pregnant, and then he was burnt alive as a trial?
Yes, a man was accused of digging up his wife, salting her, and eating her. Ultimately, in 1610, another one of those supply ships that had gotten blown off course to Bermuda made it back to the Jamestown colony, and they discovered that 90% of the colony had died. There were only a few people left. People at that point kind of wanted to jump on board this ship that had just landed there and go back to England. They were 10 miles down the river in the beginning of doing that when a flotilla of ships arrived from England and said, turn around, you're staying. The ships had some supplies, but even more than that, they had more colonists. And so this is how Jamestown very nearly was eliminated. You know, because the English were very unprepared. I should say at this point that when it wasn't the starving time, the English settlers were maintained with some food from the Powhatan Confederation of Indians, led by Chief Powhatan. Powhatan's mantle or robe is located on the slide, the second thing from the left. I've had this PowerPoint, this picture in my PowerPoint since forever, basically. And I was thrilled because in 2018, I was in England on a research trip. And I went to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And there in a big like glass case was Powhatan's actual mantle. And, you know, I'm a nerd. So I was just geeking out so much about this thing. Powhatan had a bunch of children, among whom was his favorite daughter. Her name was not Pocahontas. Pocahontas is a nickname that means little playful one. And at the time that the English showed up, she was probably about 10 years old, or she could have been as old as 12. She emphasized to her father the importance of showing hospitality to the Native Americans, and she hung around a lot at Jamestown. She learned to speak English. She was certainly friends with John Smith, who was the military leader of the colony. He was 27 years old, had fought against the Ottomans during some wars in Europe previously, but they were not romantically involved. That is a fantasy from a Disney movie. In any event, what happens in 1612? The colonists discover a smokable hybrid of tobacco. John Rolfe learned how to cultivate this hybrid that was very mild and good tasting as tobacco goes. Tobacco was thought to be medicinal in this time period, even though, of course, it's the absolute opposite. And in 1614, John Rolfe petitioned the governor of the colony there to marry Pocahontas. Pocahontas had been sort of forcefully brought to stay at Jamestown. One might even say kidnapped. She was converted to Christianity. She was renamed Rebecca. And Rolfe married her in 1614, inaugurating a period of 8 years of peace, because the marriage between John Rolfe and Pocahontas, brought together the two sides that otherwise would have been at war. Tobacco growing became the rage, tobacco and nothing else. We have reports of it being grown in the very streets of Jamestown. Laws had to be passed telling farmers that they had to cultivate a certain amount of their land with food crops, because otherwise people just wanted to grow tobacco because it could fetch such a good price. Pretty much all the tobacco that was grown in Virginia was shipped to England, and tobacco smoking became the rage there among both men and women, all except for James I, who said it was a filthy habit and didn't allow it in his presence. So he was kind of ahead of his time, seems like, as his appreciation for tobacco goes, or lack of appreciation. By 1619, Jamestown had exported 10 tons of tobacco to Europe and become a boom town. And the export business was going so well that the colonists there had enough money to import the first African servants who came by on a Dutch ship, and also the first English women who were brought to this particular colony. The women were brought as indentured servants, so before they would be allowed to marry, they had to work off 4 or 5 years of indenture, of debt. And the Africans who were imported did not start off as hereditary slaves, because as we're going to see when we talk more about the development of the colonies in British North America, slavery was a system that was introduced over about a 40-year period through a series of laws that made it hereditary and made it much more difficult. But the first Africans who were brought were in a similar situation of indentured servitude to that of the women. Okay. Questions so far?
And what was the rules of slavery in England before if you were an English person living in England, could you own a slave?
No, there weren't slaves in England at this time. There were enslaved people in the Caribbean, where there were other British colonies, and they were cultivating sugar mostly, but also tobacco on some of the Caribbean islands. But in England, nobody had slaves on actual English soil, because it was thought that slavery was a thing that had to be established through positive law. So since there was no law saying that slavery could exist on the actual soil of England, it didn't exist. In the Caribbean and other English possessions, it was a completely different story. Okay. Other questions? Zoom people, any questions? Okay. From 1619 to 1624, 4,500 English settlers were brought in on ships, but the population remained steady at about 1,000 people. What happened to the people? They died. They experienced what was called seasoning. They died due to the diseases and the lack of food, lack of potable water. The thing that really was a turning point for the English settlement happened in 1622. Powhatan's brother, after Powhatan died, his brother Opechancanough, whose name you don't have to write down, took over. And he decided to have a kind of sneak attack against the English settlement in Jamestown in 1622. A full 1/3 of the English were killed during a raid that took place in the morning. What had happened was, at this point, the Powhatan Indians and the English thought they were getting along okay. So the English had invited many of them into their homes. They were eating breakfast. And at that point, the attack happened. About 600 English were killed. This was used by the English government as an excuse to crack down very hard on the Powhatan Indians. And after this, the Anglo population began to increase, reaching 10,000 people by 1640. All right, so we have an area of the country that is settled by the English starting in the beginning of the 1500s. And by the middle of the 1600s, there's like 10,000 people there. They're beginning to become very prosperous due to the growth of tobacco cultivation and export. But there was simultaneous settlement, well, maybe just a tad later, in the more northerly part of the eastern seaboard in two different waves. The first wave of settlement to what would become the Massachusetts Bay Colony were English separatists. The Church of England at this time was perceived by many Protestants as being insufficiently Protestant. There were still bishops, there were still sort of like ministers dressed in really fancy robes, there was still incense, there were still paintings on the walls, sculptures of Jesus, icons, and a lot of Protestants were becoming really exasperated by this, thinking it was too Catholic, wanting to get down to a very strict, biblically based Protestantism. One group of these people, calling themselves separatists, emigrated from England to Amsterdam in 1608. They wanted to get away from religious persecution by the Church of England because they were seen as extremists. They stayed in the Netherlands for 12 years. But even the Netherlands was a little bit too worldly for them. They thought their children were becoming too Dutch, that they were leaving aside the biblical ways of their fathers. And so they said to the English government, can we please have a piece of land where we can go and have a settlement and nobody will bother us?
Yeah, I woke up this morning and I wanted to die.
I just want to, well, Smoke Tuesday had $2 off, so far.
Oh, tea.
Hey, I don't know which of you is unmuted, but somebody is, and we can hear your conversation. All right, hopefully that. Okay. So, in any event, they secured some patents allowing them to settle in the northern part of Virginia, otherwise known as Massachusetts. I realize the geography of the time is a bit weird. So 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Susan Constant, left Amsterdam, and then they picked up some more people in England, and they left England in September of 1620. They had about 102 passengers on board. And they landed, first they landed in what is today Cape Cod. Then they eventually landed at what is today Plymouth. They anchored in Plymouth Harbor in December of 1620. And they never referred to themselves as anything other than separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England. The term pilgrims was applied to them in 1799 by a historian, but I am talking about the people that you probably know from elementary school as the Pilgrims. Okay, questions so far? All right. What are the Pilgrims known for? Basically two things. The first was that because they didn't have in hand the royal charter with all the instructions of how exactly they were going to be obeying the king while they were in the North American settlement they had created, before they even got off the boat, the men on board signed something called the Mayflower Compact, in which they said, we're going to make whatever laws we need to make for our own self-governance until we get the charter from the king. Older textbooks used to make a really big deal out of the Mayflower Compact, saying, oh, this is the first document of self-governance in North America, but we know it's not because the Iroquois had similar kinds of documents of self-governance. It's kind of like, if you want the triumphalist narrative of American exceptionalism, then yeah, focus on the Mayflower Compact, but I thought I should tell you about it anyway. The other thing that the Pilgrims are known for is one of them sent a letter home describing a harvest festival in 1621 between the Native Americans and the English settlers. Here's what Plymouth colonist Edward Winslow wrote. Our corn did prove well, and God be praised, we had a good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good, but our peas not worth the gathering, for we feared they were too late sown. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, and by this they didn't like do arm curls, they drilled with guns. And the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it not always be so plentiful as it was at this time with us, by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. All right, so the separatists and their Wampanoag neighbors, led by Massasoit, came together, had this 5-day harvest feast, with the most likely time being around the end of September, the traditional time for harvest feasts. The interpreter for Massasoit was Squanto, Tisquantum. Why was he an interpreter? Well, Tisquantum belonged to a different tribe. His tribe had been, I'll tell the story in order. Okay, he had been taken on board an English ship against his will, twice. On the second voyage, he was actually brought to England, and then he was brought back. He learned how to speak English as a result of this kidnapping and enforced journey. When he got back to his ancestral homeland, he noticed that everybody had been killed. They had all died due to epidemic disease. So poor guy, he had no tribal affiliation. He was like a man without a country. He changed his name from, I'm not exactly sure what it was before, to the name we know him by, Tisquantum or Squanto. Tisquantum means the wrath of God, to commemorate the terrible thing that had happened to him. And he volunteered his services as a translator to the next door tribe, the Wampanoag. And that is how he became part of the picture. It isn't the case that he taught the English how to fertilize their fields with fish heads. That was something they already knew how to do, but it is the case that he was instrumental in brokering this kind of diplomacy between the English and the Wampanoag. Okay, questions about this? The final group that I want to talk about today before we move on to today's short video is the Puritans. Puritanism is a religious offshoot of Calvinism, and I'm going to talk about one of Puritanism's major tenets, the idea of predestination, in a different lecture. But suffice it to say that they were similarly evangelical, similarly hardcore Bible Protestants to the Puritans. They just were not the same people. They were wealthier, they came from a slightly different part of England, and they came in a large wave. Between 1629 and 1643, 20,000 Puritans migrated to Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they set up around Salem, Massachusetts, which is north of Boston, whereas Plymouth is kind of on the way to the Cape. John Winthrop was the leader of the settlement. This settlement was emphatically not a democracy. It was led by members of the church. And I'll explain in a subsequent lecture what you had to do in order to become a member of these Puritan churches. But one thing about the Puritans is that they very, very much thought that they had the only possible correct religious structure. And they wanted to keep anybody who was not a Puritan out of their colony. So they persecuted anybody who wasn't a Puritan.